Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello and welcome to Madison's Notes. We are the official podcast of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University. I'm your host, Laura Laurent, and today we have the sincere pleasure of welcoming renowned Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor to the show. Professor Taylor is Professor Emeritus at McGill University, and he's best known for his contributions to political philosophy, the philosophy of social science, the history of philosophy, and intellectual history. His work has earned him the Kyoto Prize, the Templeton Prize, the Berggruen Prize for Philosophy, and the John W. Klug Prize. Today we will be discussing his recent publication, Cosmic Connections, Poetry in the Age of Disenchantment, where we will uncover the meaning of poetry, the relationship that poetry has to philosophy, and the roles that they both play in uncovering what it is this human experience is all about. So please join me in welcoming Charles Taylor to Madison's Notes. Welcome to the show, Charles. It is really fantastic to have you on today. I'm really looking forward to discussing your recent book, Cosmic Connections, Poetry in the Age of Disenchantment. Welcome.
Thank you. Very happy to be here.
Wonderful. Well, so first off, I want to get started because you have such an illustrious philosophical career and you've written extensively on many subjects. And you say in Cosmic Connections that this was sort of a natural outflow from one of your more recent books, The Language Animal. And it was sort of a completion of this project. And so that makes a lot of sense and is quite reasonable. But I'm also curious, in writing about poetry, so much of it is about experience and sort of this connection to the physical world. And I'm curious, were there any particular experiences that you had in addition to your philosophical thinking that influenced the background and desire to produce this work?
Oh, yes. I mean, the book is full of experiences. The thing is, I didn't, and I don't think I could have taken up any one of these poems, or even sometimes I mention analogies, powerful resonances with music and painting and so on, or another work of art, and maybe in another. I couldn't have even conceived the idea of writing this if I hadn't been moved in exactly the way that I'm describing. I mean, the point, in every case, there is a kind of sense of connection, which is very closely tied to the work in question. The work in question sort of invokes or calls up that very experience that I'm trying to point to. And this is the challenge. It's very hard to do this. Say what what the work's in you.
And I think that's something I'd really like to get into in a little bit as well. Yeah, the habits that you've cultivated over your lifetime that have aided you in actually communicating experience, because it is much more difficult than we maybe initially take on, and we can digest great works of art and we can digest great poems, but actually sitting down to write a poem or when you're deeply moved by something, trying to communicate it is a whole other animal. And so are there particular practices that you maybe consciously or unconsciously formulated over your career that have aided you in being able to write such a piece?
Yeah, well, I mean, there could be two. I mean, if I've tried writing poetry when I was younger, so if I'd been a poet, I would have another answer to this. But what I needed was some sense of the way in which these different inspirations are related to each other, that have some kind of lateral connection to each other. But also they're all different because they're written in different circumstances. So what I needed maybe was this structure around the poems, the works, where you see them with a certain analogous thrust, which I try to define as a sense of real connection with the cosmos. And then you suddenly see analogies with other things, non-poems, for instance, doctrines of the sacred order, cosmic order, and so on. And that is where there comes to be a coherence to I hope, coherence to the book. It wouldn't be otherwise. Otherwise, It might just be a loose quantity of moving works of art, but they do come together in a rather interesting way because it does appear that there is this need or desire or yearning for some kind of what I'm calling cosmic connection. This is the word I'm putting together, and which in other epochs doesn't take the form of poetry, or and indeed poetry or music and so on. Even when there was a real belief, philosophical, cosmological belief in the order of the universe. Well, in a way, you could say that a lot of Plato is that kind of poetry, which is very ironical because Plato had this very strong belief that poetry was a possible route towards some kind of corruption, right? Take you away from the purity. But we all recognize today when we read Plato that it's poetically moving in all sorts of ways, and the images of the pure essence and so on capture us very, very powerfully. Well, yeah, the idea is therefore that you can see these bits of poetry in the 19th century, let's say, in two kinds of, as parts of two kinds of whole, as parts of just writings understood poetically through the ages that in some way link you to the cosmos, in which case Plato would unwillingly be put into the book as another example. Or you can look at the continuity, strange continuity of our concern with connection to the cosmos and the way in which it flips its way of expressing itself from one kind of writing, one kind of thinking, which we call, for instance, philosophical, into another kind of thinking, which does something strange in relation to the philosophy that preceded it, because it doesn't claim to have the same authority, it doesn't claim to achieve the same thing, namely grasping what philosophically and scientifically we know to be the larger cosmic order. It kind of drops that and goes into a new kind of relationship, that of making alive in us a powerful sense of connection. And from this standpoint, we see the whole series of epochs and forms, right, from another central point, and we break with what was the major claim of our predecessors. But when you stand back from this, it does make sense as something that's accompanied us. So then I jumped even further ahead in the last chapter and said, look, if we think, for instance, of indigenous religions, there's something very, very different from the way we see it in the Bible book and the way we see it philosophically before. But somehow the hypothesis is put in the mind of the reader that there's some kind of need we have, but it can take very different forms. And so the flip from philosophical up to the 18th century to the poetic, or if you like, musical, poetic, musical, etc. Afterwards, the flip from thinking in terms of static, continuing orders to try to achieve this kind of reconnection through time, through history. All these are looked to some need in us, which can take these very different forms.
Yeah, and I'm curious for our listeners and even for myself who haven't been able to participate in the fullness of the conversation that this book is adding to, can you give us more context about the Age of Disenchantment and why you chose to start looking at poetry from the late 16th century in Germany, like what we consider the Romantic period going forward, and just how this disenchantment has really informed and perhaps changed the expression of what you claim is this universal desire for human connection to the cosmos.
Yeah. Well, it's really the rise of modern natural science. So Galileo, Newton, of course, Newton is perhaps a really important figure here, because if you said cosmic order to people before the end of the 18th century, they would If you well, I'll go further. If you'd said cosmic order in the 16th century, yes, in the 1500s, 1600s, people would have thought of the great chain of being and so on. The regnant scientific, well, it could be called scientific, but what took the place of the highest science, highest philosophy at that time. If you move to the 19th century, I mean, after Newton, you said cosmic order, people would think Newton. that's our, it's the highest version of this, except that we are correcting it. And then as you move, you even move away. The connection to the cosmos moves away from the connection to continuing order to a connection rather with what we now think of as the cosmos, which is this vast movement in time and evolution, constantly changing. And so the sense of what you're connecting to is, if you ask people at these different periods, you get something extremely different as your answer. So in a way, it has to be, in another way also, it's science is tended to damp down because the way of connecting, the deeply emotional way of connecting is different. There are people who are great scientists who do have this kind of powerful emotional connection. And I mean, someone like Einstein, but obviously in awe, right? Struck with it. So in that way, there's continuity. But there's lots of people who think of this kind of scientific understanding in a completely different light. They aren't moved by that, but they see the fantastic differences made to our lives. I mean, we live lives in which we can control so many things in the world, particularly things that threatened us before. And so that can easily take the, take the center stage when we think of cosmic order.
Yeah, I'm curious, when thinking about philosophy and scientific thought versus poetry. Something you said earlier is that philosophy is the foreground of thought, and then poetry is something that happens afterwards. Whereas when I was reading your book, I was thinking poetry seems to be an expression of experience, and experience to me is like the first thing that happens, and then philosophy is the thought that can occur after an experience. And so therefore I kind of saw poetry as between experience and philosophy. And I'm just curious, why would you put poetry secondary to philosophy? And this opens up also a wider question of why is it that philosophy is unable to, or what is it limited by, in that it doesn't fully capture what it is you're trying to express, and how is poetry then in coming to philosophy's aid? And are they both needed? Are they is there something else on top of those two to create a full picture? And I know that's a massive question, so we can take it apart as well.
Yeah, but I mean, we can take it apart this way, that some people do have a powerful emotional experience and linking experience when they even read Newton or in Einstein's case, work out some sense of what the best science is. They can have something like a powerful experience that we all know from cases where you stand before a really majestic scene or a very beautiful forest, deep forest scene. So we all know. Oh, no, some people are indeed deaf to that, or not, not interested in that. But most of us have today, contemporaries have that. The thing is that we recognize that if we wanted to express why we're moved by all this, there's a level of expression. I mean, if you want somebody to know why you're moved by something, you can just say, look, 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 look. But if that doesn't work, what happens? Well, then you try to give them a sense of what it is. And then you're right into the poetry and some, or it can be, painting, or it can be music. You're right into that, right? But the interesting thing is that even people who can't get that, who are wanting you after the scientific explanation and are wanting you to tell them why you feel excited like that. You want to ask Einstein, well, Einstein, please, don't repeat E equals mc squared. Tell us how you're moved. And I think there probably are texts where that's what he does. The change in epoch is that these two don't necessarily go together. That is, you can both not feel in your knowledge of the cosmos, not feel anything, but also you can take some of the very traditional things which have moved people like a great mountain scene and evoke them in a way that it doesn't in any sense give you a scientific description, but it gives you a sense of that. Now, the very fact that we have a different, if we're both less limited and more limited, we're less limited because even learning the science can move us. We're more limited because a lot of people are deaf to this medium of invoking wonder, the medium of giving the scientific theory. And then something else comes in here. Well, two other things come in here, which we have to take account of. One is that there is a certain negative connotation to lots of people of using your scientific knowledge in this way because the language is so imperfect in sense of exactitude over against the scientific. So the question is, are you simply deluding yourself or going off in your own private trip? And a lot of people think that and think that it's a kind of failing if you look on these scientific findings in that light. So there is this whole very powerful strand in our culture which says we've got to be exact, we've got to get it correct. And correct means in a way which can be verified by anyone else, regardless of their sensibility, right? So there is a way of looking at things, which is not mine, not that of lots of people in the contemporary world, but that of some people, understandably. You're just self-indulgent. You're just venting. You're just giving vent to your feelings. And they have absolutely no knowledge of, no content of real knowledge. You're not grasping the world. You're being self-indulgent to your own feelings and so on. Yeah. And you get that kind of put down of the whole aesthetic dimension, which a lot of people think of as something you have to accept if you're entering the scientific world, not just dreaming. See, so there's this reading of science that discourages that. And there is, of course, the other way science can play a big role, which is in our control of the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
In a sense, if people are really drawn very strongly to the control of the world, and that's what they're getting out of progressive science, then it's kind of self-indulgent to see this in the other focus, right? And so we have this big struggle in our culture. People who read the book and think, "Wow, that's great! It's getting onto something." And I'm sure other people, they probably won't read the book. If they, by accident, read the book, they think, "Oh, this is totally self-indulgent."
I'm curious, though, if without this medium of expression and connection to larger, less tangible or specific items isn't had or indulged, what do we lose by only focusing on on the exactitude? And what does it say about us that so many of us, maybe not all, are deeply moved by the things that aren't specific?
Yeah. I mean, it's just radically cutting down our what we're getting out of the universe, or we're perceiving in the universe, and so on, in my belief. But there's also something else we could argue is stake here, that we keep telling ourselves we're crazy to carry on with this cheating of the planet, just obviously terrible, and destruction of so much of nature and so on. And of course, if you just think again in terms of utility, that's very true too. Yeah. But the point is that the kind of emotions that this understanding of the cosmos brings up are the kind that will turn us back to deep motivations that people can call on to make an effective fight against global warming. What's terribly evident now is that just being bashed over the head or by huge hurricanes or massive forest fires, which are going on in the north of our country and so on. And all the consequences that anybody, with any scientific training can tell us about that doesn't seem to do it. That's really scary, really scary. I mean, the U.S. has just had an election won by somebody who once said that climate change is a hoax. And the very moment when he was running in North Carolina and so on, and in Florida, this massive crashing, unprecedented, destructive, paroxysm of nature was going on, and people somehow don't know. I don't know why. So he got away with getting elected when he showed his total incapacity to deal with the most important issue human beings face today. Whereas the mindset that you're in, if you get very excited by the people I talk about in my book, is quite different. You have a sense of real gratitude, in a certain sense, gratitude for the world, the cosmos, the order we live in.
Yeah, and also it seems when I've engaged in both the poetry of your work and other texts, you mentioned Annie Dillard towards the end of your book as one of the modern examples of this type of poetry, which I appreciate because I had previous experience with her and really appreciate that. But this sort of sense of being in an actual relationship, which I think comes down into the connectivity part. It's not just the knowledge of great things and great, other powers or that kind of and when you say disenchantment, the enchanted part of
Yeah.
the way that the world used to have like sort of magical structures associated with it. And it's not just the knowledge of those, but the actual experience of relating to those and being in a dynamic exchange with them.
Yeah.
Is something that I saw throughout your text of sort of evoking through saying, hey, in engaging in this, in the expression of this non-specific language, we're able to actually participate,
Yeah.
which is perhaps more fulfilling than the Newtonian or the Newtonian scientific take a step back and we can look at it, but we're not affected or affecting it, which is actually not true at all.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm curious, is this capacity for relating and this capacity for experiencing something that can be trained? Like if someone doesn't feel this way, if someone isn't very emotive when they see what other people think are great moments of nature or experience or science, like is it something that they can start to get in tune with, or what do you think is is it something that can be changed in a human person?
I think definitely. You see, I mean, if maybe even reading one of these poems or listening to one of these pieces of music can awaken that, and of course it has. So all cases where it has, then another experience is just being alongside somebody when you start to look out at the mountain and the wilderness, and but it is some kind of expression on the part of your companion. He or she will say something, or maybe it could just be gas. Isn't that magnificent? And so on. And these can trigger it off. You suddenly aren't looking at the fine detail of the rocks anymore when you suddenly get a sense of the whole panorama, for instance. Or, I mean, Alexander von Humboldt, he got this from looking finely at the different rocks and geological formations. And, I know scientists who say that, just so exciting to understand that order, to grasp that order. So it can be just somebody gasping beside you, yeah, or it can be going off into a great poem yourself or himself, right? Or it can be just saying, just look, just look.
Yeah, just look. It's funny. Yeah, there's so many. I think when we think about instruction, there's
Yeah.
this sort of specificity of, do X, then Y, and everything is set up in this equation with like the same amount of energy on both sides of the equation, and you can always track it versus this seems to be a presence of mind where, like you said towards the end, you just have to be open to it, but that you can't guarantee what you're going to get out of it. You just kind of have to, there's a
Yeah.
type of looking without looking.
Right, right.
As far as poetry and specifically, um, I want to push on it a little bit. Is the feeling of connection coming from this experience of the divine? When we read a great work of poetry, is it coming and we feel quite connected to it or moved by it? Do you think that it's an expression of our connection to the divine, or could it also be instead of that? Could it be just our connection to feeling as though we have co-participated with someone who's felt something similar, and it's more about the relationality between humans as opposed to the individual to the cosmic?
Oh, it can be either. It can be either. You see, our sense of the divine may be very connected to the idea of creation, or even another kind of doctrine altogether, which are that you know, because it can be that our sense of religion, as must have been the case in human life before, is very much bound up with some idea of spiritual penetrating the cosmos in general. But let's take, which we're very familiar with in Western civilization, the Bible, which is common in the sense of creation story, which we recognize as a high element of, I mean, not the way the, what do you call biblical inerrancy people talk about it, but as a kind of attempt to grasp the great power that somehow lies behind the the creation of the universe, and that the let's say the mark, the shadow, the original impact of that is still there to be experienced, right? So we can connect it that way. But there are people that don't have any really strong sense of that biblical story, or indeed of any idea of creation. And in their case, it's going to be independent. But if you do have some sense of creation and gratitude to God or whoever created, then all this will be bound up together. And that's what is very uh, interesting and puzzling in a way, that there people can even sympathize together tremendously by reading one of these poems together or whatever, and still have very different views about what ultimately lies behind this, right? They can have a sense of what to them is the overweening power, is nature itself. So they want to put us that way. Uh, no, I have a certain kind of sense of creation, part of what moves it for me. But what's interesting here is there's not only this tremendous variety of, of modes of connection through human history, but even between two people looking at the great mountain together at Yosemite, together, there can be differences in how they construe it all.
Yeah.
But they sense by the noises they're making, or what the exclamations they're making, they really know that we're in this together. We're sharing
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, I'd like to pivot to some of the actual poets who you talk about. So you go through many of the romantics and further on, including, I'll just read from the table of contents. There's more than what I will note, but there's Holderlin, Shelley, Keats, Hopkins. We've got, I haven't heard all of these out loud, so if I mispronounce them, let me know. Mallarmé, T.S. Eliot, and then Milos.
Milosh.
Milosh. Okay, thank you.
Cool. It's not.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I appreciated the work. I just didn't know how to say their names. So, but I mean, you go quite intently through each of these authors. Were there any that were left out that you would have liked to add as like a not a necessary requirement, but ones that would have added something else to the team that you assembled?
Oh, I'm sure there were. I mean, there were certainly other poems by each of those, but you have to, limit yourself to cover this whole. But I think I chose the ones I really, really liked. It was completely subjective, completely self-indulgent, and subjective. So I don't think any poet was eliminated from the lineup. Although, if you'd said to me just before I put it in publish. There's this other poem, a poet I like very much. Why don't you read her or him, right? And if I had the energy to accede to your request, I have no doubt that, I mean, you've chosen a really good one, and there are lots out there, that it would have, I would have read and pondered and felt the resonances in me and so on, that I would find equally, worthy and important subject. The book could go on in that sense forever. I mean, it could be wide, wide shelf, right?
Yeah, I was even imagining a class structured around the content of this book, and I was thinking how unfortunate it would be to experience that as a student, because it would you could feel how much time you had to indulge in so many of these poets,
Yeah.
and how many of them you would have to leave out.
Right.
Yeah. Well, and so specifically, I'd love to talk about towards the end of the book, you bring up a poem or a piece of a poem by Matthew Arnold titled "The Buried Life," which was published in 1852, and you talk about the change of economic structure or the change of classes as we come to the end of that 19th century. And can you tell us a little bit more about how the economic changes and class changes had an impact on the Romantics, and how poetry was informed by those changes, and conversely, too, how poetry impacted the perception of those changes?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, first of all, you get a change in classes. There arises a kind of leisure class who can, and think it's important to read those poems and appreciate them and pass them around. But secondly, really important change is that the question of what I'm going to devote my life to turns up for lots and lots and lots of people who belong to that middle class and are expected to get some kind of, decent middle class job. That sounds strange in the context, but take care to have some kind of vocation, maybe go to the clergy, maybe go into the army, maybe go into the university, something, right? To take up some. And so the question, and also the new possibilities which arise, like being an artist and so on. So the question really arises for some people, what am I going to do with myself? And I think this is very important because this is the central problem for lots of people today growing up. As a matter of fact, finding your own path, finding your own vocation, is one of the, I would say, most critical needs that which we are dealing with less and less, because really the way that most people solve this problem, finding some really meaningful path in life, is that they have older sibling, they have a parent, they have maybe old uncle or aunt who sits down and sees in them something and talks it out, and they suddenly see, yeah, that's what I want to do, and yeah, I have a real gift for that. And on the other side, on the lack side, there are just tons of young people today. I mean, I attribute, it's really tragic. I attribute the rise in teen suicide, I think, to the fact that some people feel blocked. They feel this could be something important for me. They could, but I really want to find it, but I don't have any idea, and no one's helping me, and no one is saying, "Hey, I just heard you play the piano, or just heard you talk out to something, and you have a gift," and that can change totally their life. Now, that's the phenomenon that Arnold's getting there. It's the buried life.
Yeah, do you mind if I actually read the passage that you
Yeah.
quote? Yeah, so because I think it speaks to this ethos, and is part of the reason why I wanted to discuss it. Is I was like, oh, this sounds like today, and it's
Yeah.
almost 200 years in the past. But yeah, so this is an excerpt from The Buried Life by Matthew Arnold. He says, "But often in the world's most crowded streets, but often in the din of strife, there rises an unspeakable desire after a knowledge of our buried life, a thirst to spend our fire and restless force in tracking out our true original course, a longing to inquire into the mystery of this heart which beats so wild, so deep in us, to know whence our lives come and where they go.
Yeah, you see, he's onto something, a tremendous need of lots and lots and lots of people. It's really tragic when you think about it, the people who never get that. And now, but also, I mean, if in a sense, the poetry itself can perhaps give you that. I mean, perhaps that is it's a crucial spark, or crucial connection. Yeah, that's a direction that someone else can perhaps give you, and then everything changes. Really, I mean, of course, you can be, no, you're going to go to law school and everything says older generation and so on. And you think of people who could have been great pianists, but they said, "Oh, well, first of all, go to law school. You'll have a way of earning your bread if ever yeah." And the possibility is foreclosed. But it's knowing that it exists, which is the really big thing, and the big lack today among lots and lots and lots of people.
Yeah, and it calls to mind this. Often in philosophy, I found a lot of the question is sort of what is life about, but it didn't necessarily solve that similar question that we're discussing now, which is what do I do with my life and how do I necessarily navigate it? And of course, these are really. I'm so grateful that I have so many opportunities to consider. It's like the fact that I have a choice is incredible. But then we're so overwhelmed in choices, and I'm curious, does this sense of awe as inspired through poetry and other mediums, can that inform individuals in cluing into what might be a path for them that is connecting for them? It's not necessarily about being the next Mozart, but it is an experience for them where it is connecting and feels purposeful and meaningful.
Yeah, it can, but I mean, obviously, if they're on track, have the capacity to be poets, and they didn't realize it. But I mean, this jumps all sorts of into all sorts of neighboring things. So it could be just in this powerful experience of the poem, of the piece of music, and so on. They have a sense, it jumps into their mind, their heart, their soul, the sense of a path that could be. I mean, it could even uh, I'm listening to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony and going out there and doing something to create universal, some kind of service, universal humanity might be it. And then I end up in mid-sentence off of what which is nothing to do in a certain sense, except this idea of really helping people everywhere, right? There's a great, inspiring idea. Let's say I'm a doctor, I could specialist. I could make tons of money staying here in Montreal and treating patient after patient. But I feel there's something missing in my life, and I end up going anyway for a time to Africa with Doctors Without Borders. These experiences don't necessarily connect simply to what you were doing, but they can open this. That's what I want to do.
They give you just the space to have that experience of recognition. Will we be more fulfilled and more connected if we make choices based on sort of this internal relationship that we have with ourselves to recognize these? And maybe it's not a relationship with ourselves, but it's a relationship with the cosmos to recognize these poles or these epiphanies, or is it better to, in a more modern sense, use philosophy and science and reason to kind of optimize?
No, it has to be something that really inspires you deeply. And then, of course, knowing that there's such a thing as Doctors Without Borders, just there knowing these possibilities, suddenly it takes on an electricity that you didn't have before. But it's this kind of deep aesthetic, cosmic, or cosmic experience, which can, but it can also be that you love somebody very much, since your parents, an old uncle that you really, love and admire, and can just by his or her life point out these possibilities. And the point is, do you get grabbed by it? Do you get electrified by it? Do you get, seized by it? That is because these possibilities are around us all the time, but they don't connect with some very deep aesthetic, religious experience. And when they do, then it's wonderful.
Yeah, and it seems to be tying into just a different sort of knowledge.
Yeah,
And I don't know if it's a knowledge because it's not always something that you don't hold it. It's like a capacity for a type of knowledge. Uh,
that's right. Something, yeah, you can get lit up by
yeah.
these experiences.
Yeah, and how does this play into your understanding of identity? Because you talk about this briefly, um, and I think identity is an important and interesting conversation that's happening both in a lot of like psychology realms, in the therapeutic realm, but also politically, and sort of how we relate to communities and ourselves. But you make the difference between sort of inherited commitments versus someone's ability to identify with a specific thing. And can you talk more about how you see identity in the context of this cosmic connection, and how it's informed by this cosmic connection?
Yeah. Well, you see, your identity, how do you define your identity? Well, it's really things that are the most important, most vital for you. See? And it can be belonging to some group, can be finally practicing some kind of skill or creative activity. It can be, it can be modeled on, as I say, your great uncle or something. It's all these things which, from the outside, could leave you, dead. I mean, not, and will leave some other people totally dead. But somehow, in, as you understand later, in combination with certain possibilities, capacities you had or had the makings of, and you know that ex post afterwards because you throw yourself into, well, becoming a doctor and going to, whatever, and by realizing that, yeah, that was it. But you get the pre-intuition. Now, identity is really the things about you, around you, that are the most important. And some people, being of the nationality they are, they're very strongly about that, being family they are, but being able to help in various ways that they didn't realize. All these things can be the triggers. And the really terribly important thing is to make sure and measure what's possible, that every kid somehow has a way of getting in contact with these possibilities, having that trigger. Well,
This clues me in a little bit because I love McIntyre, and I read After Virtue in college, and it just sent me spiraling into so many
yeah,
interesting adventures that were brought about, sort of thinking about narrative and how identity is intertwined with this idea of self-narrative, almost of like the stories that we tell about ourselves. And particularly, I think we can see this also, though, in our previous comments about this lack of connection that many young people are feeling towards, what am I doing with my life? What should I do with my life? In that we have a lack of social narrative. And in fact, we have a lot of war kind of conflict on what our social narratives ought to be. And communities are just really distraught. We don't have very many elders who are storytellers, and we're sort of these narrative-based folks. And I know that you've been in relationship with Alistair McIntyre for forever, and so I'm just curious how you see sort of his philosophy of narratives intertwining with what you're presenting here in regards to identity
oh
specifically.
yeah, no, I think his philosophy of narrative is absolutely you're right. I mean that narrative understanding is what you want. It's the kind of understanding you want. Narrative, not necessarily of what you already experienced, what you've been through, but narrative as a sense of what a possible connected life, its various stages would really make sense together, which is how you get excited and seized by a certain direction before you embark on that. And it's that moment of the potential, that is the trigger, will be the trigger. Let's hope I mean, it can fail to be because you're just not, you don't respond to that. But even a very powerful aesthetic experience, a very powerful musical experience, it not necessarily the narrative is that you become a great pianist. No, it can be that you become precisely this doctor of the borders, right? It's something to do with the sense of inspiration you get from listening to Beethoven piano or what calls this kind of thing up, even in very vague form. But if you start on that kind of thing, can be another kind of service you can render later on. But you start on a path. You're energized to start on a path, and which turns out, maybe you make modifications on, which turns out to be when 50 or 40 people say, well, tell me what your identity is. So you would automatically say, well, identity is fixed by the story that I've been trying to live.
Yeah, that vision is important, and is there's so many places we could go to, but then it pulls into your comments on imagination and that ability to sort of project yourself into the future. But I'm just looking towards time, and I'm reflecting on the conversation we've had, which has been really enjoyable and also vague. If I were, an analytical philosopher listening to this podcast, I'd say, oh, there's a bunch of vague terms getting thrown around. But you yourself have done some really serious philosophical work. And how have you found the balance between communicating your work about this cosmic connection to philosophers and vice versa? And what is the reaction from the philosophical side been to this specific work, Cosmic Connections?
Well, I mean, it's very hard because you struggle to articulate it. But the reaction has been immensely satisfying. I mean, I expected that book to be maybe picked up by a few people here and there, because there are people who pre-programmed, let's say, to be triggered off by this, lovers of poetry and so. And I'm sure there are a lot of philosophers who think this now, that there's all this kind of very subjective stuff. It's all very well, but it doesn't get you very far. Who will probably not read the book. But I'm tremendously surprised and gratified by how many there were in the first category, and the ones in the second category I'll never hear about.
Yeah, well, and I don't know, for my response to that hypothetical analytical person who says, it won't get you very far, I'm like, but it will get you started. And that's the hardest part in the modern age with so many choices. Getting started is the hardest part. So I'm curious, what is something that has grasped you recently and has inspired you? Do you know the direction of your next project? You have one, and it doesn't have to be a next project, but even if it's just a moment that you felt that sort of tingle, that enlivening sense of cosmic connection, when was that for you?
Oh, I mean, all the time. We have a place in the country not far from Montreal, yet it's constantly renewed. I mean, I've been living there since around 90, and I even got the idea of this book up there in the mountains, big forests and wolves and bears, all of these. And I got the idea there. Very different book. I wrote the chapter in Baudelaire first, but the idea of the book, some kind of vague idea, wouldn't match exactly what ended up. I got there. So it was really very, very autobiographical.
Well, for as vague or different of a subject it might be, I really look forward to seeing its fullness if it comes to fruition. Well, Charles, thank you so much for coming on to today's episode of Madison's Notes. It's been a sincere pleasure. And for our listeners, I highly, highly recommend Cosmic Connections. Even if you're intimidated, pick it up, read a page or two. I'm convinced it will not disappoint. But thank you, Charles. Thank you for tuning in on today's episode of Madison's Notes. I hope you enjoyed listening as much as I enjoyed having this conversation. Now, make sure to like, subscribe, send this podcast to a friend or a foe, and of course, leave us some notes in the comments about what you think. I'm Laura Laurent, and this has been Madison's Notes.